Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we are going to get into people pleasers. So this episode stems from a Facebook video that I sent to Mark, and the title of the video was called Toxic Empaths. And we're going to get into what toxic empathy supposedly is, if it's actually a thing or if it's just pop psychology.
I have a real problem with it, so we can wait. I'll go into it. Just the
Okay.
whole naming, but
Okay, yeah. This guy, he's probably an influencer, and this is probably good for his ratings. I will post a link to the video in our show notes so you can watch it, because he does bring up some valid and important points in terms of the dynamics of.
That's true. I agree with the things he brought up. I just have a problem with the toxic empathy. The label toxic empathy, yeah.
Yes, and label, it's semantics, really.
Mm-hmm.
But
right.
Words matter.
Right. Well, that's when I saw it. I thought, well, he's just talking about people pleasers. Although I don't know if he uses that term. Do you remember? Does he use that term I don't think he uses the term, but I think that's what he's talking about. So that's why we titled our episode "People Pleasing."
Yeah, well, and people pleasing is very common.
It is, and it is a problem. So
it is.
I don't want to detract from what he's trying to say.
Yeah.
I just, that whole idea of influencers, one just goes right over my head. I mean, I understand there are a lot of them out there, and I think he probably needs a catchy phrase, maybe to to call his episode. So
and so again, like it's what he's saying is important, and the dynamic specifically that he's talking about is important because what he's talking about is problematic.
Yes.
So I thought we could start with kind of talking about where people pleasing stems from. And so we all have a psychological need for acceptance, right? Because we are social creatures. And so we need some sort of a social network, and we all have this need to feel a sense of belonging somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Right, or acceptance for who we are. And so I think that here's some things that could underlie the people pleasing. I think the first one, maybe obvious, is poor self-esteem.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that for self-esteem, I think I've said this before, that I think of it as an internal barometer that we have of how we think the world sees us, or how they experience us. And so if we think that the world sees us, in a positive light, then our self-esteem is generally higher. So you can think of it as internally motivated, or internal, that you get it from, you just have it inside, or external validation. So internal validation or external validation. And I think that what happens often with people pleasing is you go overboard, essentially, to try and meet the needs of others. And I think often, or maybe always, at the expense of your own needs. And the goal is that external validation, so that you feel like the other person is holding you in high esteem. So I think poor self-esteem is one. Being insecure is another. But I think those are, to me, poor self-esteem, insecurity, they're really close together, I think. Perfectionism, which is one we don't often think about, but in a certain families of origin, or even there are certain spiritual traditions where the idea of being perfect is important. Mm-hmm. And the idea of service is important. Mm-hmm. And so I think in the person's quest to fulfill that, I don't know if it's a requirement, or fulfill that part of the religious or spiritual tradition, then they kind of go overboard. They lose themselves. And, I have certainly heard people talk about it and think that that's actually the way we ought to be. Is, we lose ourselves in serving others. I think serving others is important.
Yes.
I don't think we should lose ourselves, though.
I agree. And having been in a religious culture, there's definitely this idea that, it's a saying, forget your troubles and go to work. If all you can focus on is just what's going on in your life and just all your own negative, well, put that aside and try to focus on somebody else. Try to better somebody else's lives. There's merit to that.
There is. I agree with that to a point. there's merit to it.
Exactly. But I mean, at the same time, if you are constantly focusing on other people's problems and trying to help other people's problems and never solving any of your own problems,
Right.
it's also that old saying, you can't give from an empty cup. You can't give from an empty pitcher. So if you
No.
don't take the time to fill your own pitcher, you can't give to other people. You can't help other people. And so, I think you need to take time for yourself. And, we talk a lot about self-care. And also something that we've said before is we really like balance. Balance is
Yes.
really important. And
Yeah.
so, like you said, it is important to serve others, and it's very, I think, community involvement is really great. Giving to those less fortunate than you, these are all good things, but you can certainly take it too far.
Yeah.
And
So I think making it simple, I think it probably comes mostly from family of origin,
yeah.
how we're brought up, and how we get that validation from our parents,
Hmm.
possibly teachers even. But I think it's mostly about that we want to be accepted for who we are, our authentic selves, not what we can do for
Yeah.
others,
Hmm.
which
Which
is
is,
important to do for others, but that's not how we should feel acceptance.
yeah, which is why there's this push in parenting to focus on kids, like when we're praising kids, to focus on their effort,
Right. Yes.
right? Rather than saying, oh, you're so smart.
Yeah. Yeah.
Say something like, you worked really hard and I'm proud of your hard work.
Yes.
You know,
That's always better.
yes. And again, because you're not always going to be the smartest person and you're not always going to be smart about something,
But
right?
you
I
can
mean,
always work hard.
but you can always work hard.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really what it stems from. And honestly, I'm just because you once said to your kid, oh, wow, you're so smart, or you're so good, or you did this. I promise saying that to your kid one time hasn't ruined
Yeah.
them, because
Right.
I was told those things as a child, things like that as a child. And I mean, I turned out fine. And on the flip side, I was a people pleaser. I was very much a people pleaser, or I desperately wanted to fit in. And so I remember,
Can I ask what the context was in which you were a people pleaser? Just your whole life? Or when you
yeah,
say you wanted to fit in?
in school.
Oh,
So when I was in the towards the end of fourth grade, we moved to a different school district. And so when I started school, this group of girls kind of, I can't tell you why. Anyways, they kind of flocked to me. And in
uh-huh.
hindsight, it might have been, and they invited me to play softball, and it might have been I was really bad at softball, and I think that bugged them. And so they kind of turned on me and they bullied me. They really did some kind of cruel things. I think they told my mom, or they told me wrong games. They tried to hide my glove. At one point, they tried to keep me from playing because I mean, I was bad at it, and I was probably bringing down the whole team. I was probably making them lose.
Uh-huh.
Anyways, I mean, and we were in fourth grade, right? And so I spent years trying to figure out where I went wrong, trying to figure out how to get these girls to like me again. And I would say for probably at least 2 years, I wanted desperately to fit in with these girls, and I wanted desperately for these girls to like me again. And, from then on, in any circle that I was, or any circle that I found myself in, I wanted people to like me. It was important for people to like me. And so I would mimic personalities. So,
Oh,
I
okay.
really would. And so, yeah, so and I mean, I did this for years, and I still catch myself doing it sometimes. If I spend a lot of time around somebody, I notice that I'll start to mimic a lot of their nuance. Like I'll pick up on their nuances and I'll start to talk like them a little bit, right?
Uh-huh.
Almost like personality mirroring. And it's
Yes.
not something I do consciously, and in my mind, and maybe in my mind, it could be this way of I just want to be accepted. I want to fit in with this person. Or it could just be because I'm jiving with them, I'm maybe mirroring them anyways.
Well,
So,
it's the strength. I think it speaks more to the strength of the wiring in the brain.
oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's experience is what wires in our brain, and so you're an adolescent,
Hmm.
and which is your brain's still wiring at that point, and so you want to be accepted. You're feeling insecure about the relationships. I mean, it makes sense to me that you
Yeah.
still do it at
Hmm.
times because
Hmm.
it's certainly. I think what I'm hearing is it's not the way it was back when you were an adolescent, but it still surfaces sometimes. And it probably surfaces unknowingly if you when you're feeling a little bit insecure.
Yeah. I mean,
And
if I think about it, that could very much be the case.
yeah.
It's usually when I hit a certain point in a new relationship, like a new
Hmm.
friendship,
Hmm.
is usually when I hit it. But for a long time, I was very concerned about what people thought about me. Very, very concerned. And people liking me was important. It was very important for people to like me and accept me. And what changed that for me was getting married. So when I got married, I had Curtis's acceptance, like full and complete acceptance. He accepted me for who I was. And it really freed me to just be myself. Getting married was very freeing because I all of a sudden didn't have to worry about people liking me because I had one person who I could trust and who I had a secure relationship with.
But if you think about it, back in adolescence,
Hmm.
that's kind of a goal for all adolescents is to be liked by everyone. And that's what we
Hmm.
want,
It's
right?
true. Yeah.
Is the acceptance. And so I think the problem is how do you move out of that once you become an adult? And for you, it was, getting married and having
Hmm.
that total acceptance from someone else. And so I think hopefully most of us move out of that
Yeah.
phase, but some people don't.
Yeah. But I certainly know there are people as an adult who they're people pleasers.
Yeah.
And so and that's what this guy was talking about. And so you mentioned early on about people pleasers are people who it's so important for them to be liked that they will do anything to try to make people happy and they put the needs of everybody else above their own. And that is what this guy called toxic empathy.
Yeah. So here's my problem
Okay,
with
let's
toxic
hear it.
empathy. See, I think empathy, I think we don't have enough empathy
Okay.
in the world. I think we need more empathy. And I don't know that I would, maybe anger can be toxic. I was just thinking about other emotions that might be toxic. I don't think empathy can ever be toxic. You're
Okay.
because you're having an emotional response, and what he's talking about is the behavior.
Oh, you make a good
They're
point.
they're separate. And
Hmm.
so, I think he's confusing that. Well, actually, I listened to it a couple of times, but in my mind, he's confusing the emotion with the behavior, and they're really separate. So I think you can have a lot of empathy. In fact, I think we need to cultivate empathy for others, but then the behavior is different.
Hmm.
Now,
Okay.
I think he talks somewhere in there about a narcissist. And so that, again, to me is a separate problem.
Hmm.
Doesn't, in my mind, doesn't have anything to do with toxic empathy. I think it has to do more with the person who's the narcissist. And
Yes.
narcissists are so good at the charming and I'm going to use a word that's often used with child sexual abuse, grooming. I think they
Hmm.
groom people,
Okay.
not for abuse, well, for emotional abuse, I think.
Hmm.
And so they're really good at making you feel really wonderful. And so they draw you in and then it's almost like they start feeding on you emotionally. It's like
Yeah.
emotional vampires is what it is. But again, I don't think that has anything to do with empathy at all. So if you take a relationship, you fall in love with someone and they're charming and this person's a narcissist and you don't realize it. Most
Hmm.
people who I see who end up marrying narcissists and they come in, they really don't realize it because they fall in love. And I think narcissists are really good at making people fall in love with them.
Hmm.
And then it shifts around, and the narcissist then becomes that emotional vampire. I think they call it the narcissistic feed, where then the partner has to do everything for and build up the narcissist. And that, I think, is what this guy is talking about, how it ties into his idea of toxic empathy. But
Hmm.
again, it doesn't make sense to me. The behavior is bad.
Yes.
Behavior is a problem. I don't think it has anything to do with empathy, period.
Right. Exactly. And I think it has to do more with the fact that narcissists probably love people pleasers
Oh,
because
sure. Yes, because it feeds them. Oh my gosh.
Mhm. Yeah.
It's like this constant flow of that emotional blood to them.
Exactly. Well, because
Yeah,
narcissists, they want that constant validation and
yeah,
they want
yeah,
people doting on them and they want
yeah,
people trying to please them because that feels good to them. And people pleasers want somebody that wants to be pleased,
yeah.
right? And so it's almost like mutual destruction.
Well,
Well, oh,
So it feels good to the people pleaser at the start,
Yes.
but then I think for most people they wear out. And at some point, and I think this is especially true in a marriage that I've seen before, I think it
Hmm.
can go along at some point, and then if you have kids, it totally changes the
Yeah.
issue. But you want something back
Yes.
at some point, and at that point, you're too far into it, and the pattern is too ingrained that
Hmm.
it's almost impossible for you to get anything back
Yeah.
from this
Yeah.
partner,
Yeah.
because you've gone too deep into it, and so you're left with really poor choices because you can stay in the marriage and keep doing what you've been doing as far as that
Hmm.
people pleasing, but that says for the rest of your life you're not going to be fulfilled at all, and you're just going to be constantly giving and never getting, and that's a problem.
It really is. And marriage, we've talked this idea before, marriage really needs to be as 50-50 as it can be.
Hmm.
And it's not always going to be, because there's going to be days where your spouse can only give 10%, and that's
Yeah.
the best that they can give. And as a loving and caring partner, you should give that 90% that day.
Hmm.
But if you're constantly giving that 90%, you can't, that's just not sustainable.
Right.
And
That's not.
and that's the problem, and that's any relationship has to be like that. And so I agree with you that it's what he's talking about is behavior and not
Hmm.
the emotion. I think that is an
Yeah.
important
Yeah.
distinction to make, the difference between emotions and behaviors. Because you can say, oh, somebody is fearful. Well,
Uh-huh.
can they really be fearful? Because fear is an emotion and fearful is an action. Does that make sense?
Well, I think that what they're talking about is fear does change our behavior, but it tends
It's
to
true.
paralyze us.
Yeah.
It makes it so we can't take any action, and that's probably what they're probably describing the state of someone who is stuck. Uh, and think often when people are stuck, they're fearful. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I think that's an important distinction to make. And so, but again, he makes a really good point that if you keep putting everybody else's needs before your own, then you're not going to have any, eventually, you're not going to have anything left to give. You
Right.
can't be your best self. And so, I don't think we can talk about this topic without talking about moms, because that struggle is so real, because moms genuinely have to put the needs of their children before their own. Yes, I really need to eat, but I have, four other people or three other tiny people that can't eat, right? And so,
Right. But up to a point, Liz, I think. I
no,
mean,
you're right.
and,
You're
and so
right.
if you think about like the first year of a child's life, that's absolutely true because they can't do anything. But
Mhm.
as the child grows, and the idea is that you help the child to become self-sufficient. But
Yes,
that there are mothers out there who don't let their children
it's
become
true.
self-sufficient, right?
Yeah.
And they are. I just heard a story from someone, and I think oh, okay, this kid's going off to college.
Uh-oh.
And this is not a client. This is just a family that I know. This kid's going off to college. His mother still lays out his clothes every night on his bed. So this kid's got to be 18 or 19,
Okay.
graduating from high school. He's going to go off and live in a dorm. He had no idea. I think he had no idea how to work a microwave. So
Oh,
but so do you see that you take it to the extreme? That's not toxic empathy. That's just poor behavior.
yeah.
So if you're one or two, then yes, and
Yes.
you do that, but then you slowly have to start shifting. I think it's good for the kid as they get older
Mhm.
to realize at times mom matters too,
Yes.
and that you can wait. It's okay. Mom's doing something else. But so there are some mothers who don't ever pass beyond that. Anyway, that's the
Yeah.
most extreme story I've ever heard. Um,
Yeah. Well, or kids that go to college and don't know how to do their laundry.
yeah, yeah, laundry, or how to handle finances, money,
Yeah.
and so I'll go out on a limb here and make a guess. I think it's more often males who are
Mm,
in that particular category who don't know how to do their laundry or cook because their mothers have done it for them. I would
yeah.
guess that culturally, I think we probably spend more time teaching young women how to get
Mm,
along in the world.
yeah. Which it just No, it's not gonna work.
No, no. And so, I mean, you're right, but about mothers, and you
Yeah.
have to give your all. But again, I would never label that toxic empathy at all.
No, 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 but
Um,
I'm no, but
but it's a good point because it's empathy. I think it's the empathy. The empathy is being able to put yourself in the other person's emotional state, which is exactly what attachment is. So
yeah,
attachment with a kid, with a small child, is you're really using your empathy. I hear that cry, and so you're putting yourself in that place. What am I going to do for
yeah.
that child? That's attachment,
Mhm.
and and so that is all about empathy, I think.
Right, yeah, exactly. I mean, Curtis and I were never cried out parents. We couldn't handle it. And so if my baby cried, I went to my baby, as much as I could almost every time.
Mhm.
But that's draining to be
Yeah.
doing because you are momming 24/7. It's hard to get a break. And so, that's why it can be so difficult for mothers. And so that's why we talk, this idea of you can't give from an empty pitcher. Well,
No.
your pitcher also isn't going to do any good if there's a hole in your pitcher. And moms are really good at getting holes poked in their pitchers because it's such a demanding
Mhm.
job. And so, it is so important to take time for yourself. And so I'm going to reference our recent episode that we did self-care.
Uh-huh.
And I've heard moms say before, I don't have time for self-care. You've
You've
got to,
gotta have time for self-care.
even if it is just 15 minutes, even
Mhm.
if you sacrifice 15 minutes of sleep for a little bit of self-care, you're going to sleep better.
Yeah.
Eh, you know,
So I wanna answer your question definitively. Toxic empathy is not a real thing. It's a
no,
made-up
yeah.
term.
Yeah. Now, people pleasers
Oh, that's
is
a real thing, but it's not a I mean, that
it's a behavior.
it's just describing behaviors more than anything.
Yes. And so I think that's probably the biggest takeaway is it's important to distinguish behaviors from emotions because I
Right.
don't think it's possible to have too much empathy, but you can have empathy for somebody and recognize there's nothing I can do to help this
Yeah.
person, but I can be there for them emotionally. And
Right.
so and that's another thing that I think is worth talking about is or maybe kind of where I went to when I first heard toxic empathy is this deep need to help ease somebody's pain. And I felt that where somebody's telling me a hurt that they're going through, and I want so bad to take away their pain or to help ease their burden. And you want to do something. And, you know, you have to recognize and step back and realize you can't take away the pain. You can't take away the hurt, but being there with them and just kind of holding that emotion and just validating them that's oftentimes enough, just letting them lean on you emotionally.
Right, and so I do work with couples all the time. Usually it's the husband who wants like, if they see that their wife is sad, so the wife is
Mhm.
experiencing this emotion, they want to take that away or make her not sad, and you can't
Yeah.
do that with anyone. You can't change the other person's emotional state.
Mhm.
It's up to the person to do that, and so
Yeah.
all you can do is be there and be supportive. Yeah.
Yeah, men want to fix things,
Yeah.
and which I mean, that's stereotypical, but
But
it it's a
it doesn't work long term in marriages for like, if I'm trying to fix my wife all the time, then eventually she feels less than because somebody has to fix her
yeah.
when she can fix herself is what you want to be able to do.
Yes, and so well, and that's a skill that I think a lot of men need to learn is
Yes.
it's a skill that I had to learn. It's I don't need to solve people's problems. For a long time when somebody came to me with a problem and they wanted to talk about their problem, I'm like, I'm going to come up with a solution. I'm going to find something, I'm going to say something that's going to fix it and it's going to make their life better.
Yeah.
And over the years I've realized that I don't need to fix their problem. Like I
No.
don't I
Well,
don't need
I think you can't.
exactly. I can't
Yeah.
fix their problem. Sometimes life just sucks. I
Mhm.
mean, it sucks when bad things happen and you can't take it away. But what you can do is you can sympathize or empathize with them and say, that's awful. Man, that sounds terrible to have to go through. And
Yeah.
then all of a sudden this person is thinking, well, thanks. Yeah, it feels good to have somebody validate and somebody to acknowledge that what I'm going through is hard. And it took me a long time to figure that out because I wanted so badly to be helpful. I wanted so bad to be able to help somebody who was struggling. And I wanted
Mhm.
to help that person that was hurting, that it took me, years to realize that I can't. And that was a painful lesson for me to learn, for me to come to this realization of I can't fix people, you
Yeah.
know, but I can sympathize with them.
I think maybe we ought to talk about briefly, what do you do if you're a people pleaser? How can you
Yes.
move beyond that?
Mhm.
And I think there are two main things. And we probably won't, we don't have time to go into a great deal. But first, I think you need to figure out what's underlying the drive to
Mhm.
be a people pleaser. Is that insecurity? Is it the low self esteem? And often you don't need to do this, but often it's helpful to be in therapy. If you go in very specifically to say, this is what I'm dealing with, then a therapist ought to be able to help you really focus in on that. So that's just the talk therapy, and that's just the insight part.
Mhm.
But you have to change behavior. And so I think, didn't we do an episode on boundaries? Or is it, I mean, we've talked about boundaries a lot, but
Yeah, we talked.
it's
Oh yeah, we've done a
it's
couple
all about
episodes.
setting boundaries,
Okay.
is what it is. Someone comes to you and said, I really need help moving, this weekend. Well, if you honestly can't do it, either,
Yeah.
you have something else, then you have to be able to set the boundary and say no, or learning how to say no, which is really hard
Yes.
for people pleasers to learn how
Mhm.
to say no. And so I think it's all about boundaries. I think boundaries make for really good relationships. It's my favorite word.
Yeah.
Frankie and Jess always used to say that
Mhm.
my favorite word is boundaries. But I think it really is helpful. But a lot of people don't know how to do it. Or I think probably more realistically, they're afraid to do it. They're
Yeah.
afraid. Like if I set a boundary with you, you may not like me, or at least
Mm.
that's my fear.
Yes.
So it
Yeah.
goes entirely against what the people pleaser is trying to achieve
Mhm.
to be able to do that. That's why I think if you're going to work at setting boundaries, you need to have the insight to
Yeah.
understand, where does this come from and what's driving my behavior. So I think those are the two main things that people can do to pull themselves out of that. But I think ultimately they'll be happier. And here's the other thing: in a relationship, if the person isn't okay with you taking care of yourself sometime,
Mhm.
that is not a good, healthy relationship. And
Yes.
maybe you shouldn't be in that relationship. Or
Yes.
maybe the other person should work on changing as well.
Right. And then you need to have that conversation. But again,
Right.
it's for a people pleaser, it's going to be hard.
That's hard.
And I want to acknowledge that, we often talk about things like that. Well, if you want to change this, then you just need to do this. And it's easier said than done. And so I
I
want to
think we both
acknowledge,
realize it's hard. I
yes.
certainly
y-
acknowledge that. Yeah.
And because it's a process, and
Mhm.
processes take time. And so, I think the other thing is, you need to another good idea is to work on self-acceptance
Yeah.
of, being
Yeah.
more accepting of yourself. So, that kind of goes back to self-esteem, is because it's so important for people to like you. Well, you ask yourself, do you like yourself? Do you like who you are? And if you don't like who you are, either find out why or find out how to get to a space where you do like yourself, and just be okay with who you are,
But
and
that self acceptance, I think, is really about shifting the validation from external to internal.
okay.
Is what you're
Yeah.
doing
Okay.
with that.
Yeah.
I want to give just a brief idea, maybe for someone who's thinking, okay, I want to learn how to set boundaries. I think if you go about it and think about all the boundaries I need to set, that's going to be
Mhm.
overwhelming.
Yes.
Pick one person and pick one thing
Yeah.
that you would be able to set a boundary around. Because typically in our relationships with other people, there are events or behaviors that tend to recur, they're recurring. And
Mhm.
so you can probably say, okay, I know this friend, or I know my partner is going to ask this or ask this, and I want to be able to set a boundary. So pick something specific
Mhm.
and something that's doable, and just start there and get some success with one thing about setting the boundary, which then lets you know you can do it in other contexts and with other people. That's
Yeah.
how I go about doing that.
Yeah. Uh, yeah. Baby steps, or one
Baby
step.
steps, yeah. Yeah,
Yes.
what about Bob? Baby steps.
Yes. So, one step at a time. You
Mhm.
don't make these changes overnight or in a day,
Yeah,
or oftentimes even in a couple days. It starts just a little bit at a time.
yeah, Yeah.
and you're going to have setbacks. I think that's the other thing. And this was another trap that I fell into, was this all or nothing thinking. Oh, I messed up in my goal, I'm just going to give up.
Yeah.
Well, it's just a setback.
It's a setback, and also maybe the goal's too big.
Yes.
And I think it's really important to break goals up into doable parts.
Yeah. And so I remember when I kind of changed that mentality, and this kind of goes back to people pleasers and ties into this idea of perfectionism. I think this all or nothing thinking,
Yeah.
it really ties into this. If you can't do it perfectly, why even try? That's not a very healthy mentality.
Right. And this is a bit of an aside, but so the reason when you say to a child, you're so smart, that's actually the end result often is
Mhm.
the kid wants to be a perfectionism. If they can't get the A, then they
Yeah.
don't try, and it's either the A or they get the F. And you
Yes.
see that all the time.
Yeah.
Whereas if you focus on effort, then the kid is okay with whatever's in between
Yeah.
the
Because
A
they
and the F. Yeah,
because they worked hard.
right. And so it's not about the A, it's about working hard. And it
Mhm.
totally changes how they do in school. Anyway,
Be-
that's
but you're right. And this goes down to building a self-esteem
right.
and not being a people pleaser, is you need to learn how to fail. It's
Yeah. And
important.
it's, yeah, because it's okay.
Yeah, it's important for kids to learn how to fail. It's important for kids to know that you're not always going to get it right the first time, but you
Yeah.
need to keep going. It's okay to struggle. It's okay if something is hard. How are you going to handle it? All right. Next week we are going to get into addiction recovery. So, speaking of taking small steps,
Yeah.
addiction recovery is a lot of really small steps. So,
And this.
yeah, so that's going to be a good episode, and we will see you all next week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.